A very big good afternoon or good morning from the Roosevelt Institute for American Studies in Middelburg, the Netherlands. My name is Giles Scott-Smith, and I am very happy to open this conference on public health and disease in the American century. For those of you who don't know us, the Roosevelt Institute, or RIAS for short, we are a library, archive, research center, and conference center devoted to the study of American history and transatlantic relations. So first, just a couple of words about the setup for our conference over the next couple of days, and then I'll give a short introduction to the theme before introducing our keynote this afternoon. So for any technical issues you may have, do please reach out to my colleague, Dario Fazzi. Dario will certainly be available. He's chairing this afternoon, and we'll work out if there are any issues that are still present after today. We'll make sure that we get them sorted out for you tomorrow and Friday. We are also recording the event. You may recall I did mention this in one of my preparatory emails, and I hope that you're all okay with that we can keep this this record of the event. So I'd just like to now take the next 12 minutes or so to briefly introduce the theme for the next couple of days. And of course, public health and disease is a very broad subject, and I did aim to give some guidance for where we might go with this, with a couple of kind of scene-setting questions when I was communicating with both speakers and commentators in previous emails. So the first scene-setting question was this: how did public health present an opportunity for the expansion of US power through state or private means, both domestically and internationally, in the American century? And then the flip side of that one was really this: how did disease present a threat to the ideals, values, and capacities of the American century? So I think that kind of sets up the two sides, how there has been real drive to address and of course solve issues of public health concern, but how public health and particularly disease has been a challenge, and at times, as we've seen very recently, an overwhelming challenge to those same public and private capacities. Now, of course, we're starting off this event in a very interesting period. We have the Biden administration wanting to claim a mandate for nationwide vaccination to head off COVID-19. And this has kind of triggered a very interesting historical debate about legal mandates for vaccination. And it's turned up the fact that there's a long history to this particular issue. And we can go back to 1809 for the first vaccine mandate law against smallpox. And then in 1905, the US Supreme Court ruled in Jacobson versus Massachusetts that Cambridge City law could require smallpox vaccination because citizens did not have the right to put others at risk. And then in the 1922 Supreme Court decision, which upheld childhood school mandates, we had Judge Brandeis calling this ruling settled law. So there was a kind of sense that this was really kind of beyond the realm of debate anymore. But the thing is, of course, that Biden is now claiming a national vaccination mandate. And up until now, it's only really been upheld at the state and city levels, so that federal government technically has no precedent or power to demand that all citizens in every state must be vaccinated. So it's already indicating a very important area of federal state divisions of responsibility and power. Now, of course, public health is a very Rooseveltian theme. We can look at Theodore Franklin and Eleanor and how, in each of their particular ways, they were pushing the boundaries of what the federal state could achieve in securing improved livelihoods for the American people and indeed for people around the world. Theodore, of course, is best known for her winning the passage of the Meat Inspection and Pure Food and Drug Acts in 1906, related to his awareness of the situation in the Chicago meatpacking industry. But already before then, as a young Republican member of the New York State Assembly, he'd pushed for a ban on homemade cigars, interestingly enough, due to the fact that he discovered the health risks related to production of homemade cigars and the risks that presented to whole families. And then, of course, later on, he led a White House conference in 1909 on the care of dependent children, which led to the formation of the Children's Bureau, rules on adoption, and the Child Welfare League. And really, one can also point to his National Progressive Party manifesto of 1912, which include a whole swathe of national public health initiatives, such as universal health insurance, end of child labor, and a minimum wage. If we go on to Franklin Roosevelt, he continued the political struggle for increasing federal competences. In November 1934, he ordered the Committee on Economic Security to look into introducing national health insurance as part of what would become the Social Security Act the following year. Now that act, of course, as we know, is a milestone in US public health history, incorporating old age insurance, unemployment insurance, aid to families with dependent children, and support for the disabled. Eleanor herself was a patron of many social causes, but it's notable that she donated much of the income she received for her radio work to the American Friends Service Committee. She had first encountered the AFSC Quakers through their social welfare programs in the Pennsylvania and West Virginia coal mining regions. This led to the foundation of the Arthurdale Subsistence Homestead Project in West Virginia in 1934, and she continued to work closely with the AFSC in the provision of assistance to those in need. So all three Roosevelts demonstrate some of the central themes that we will be covering from different angles over the next couple of days. Firstly, they all challenged the limits to the power of federal government to act in the interests of all citizens, something which the judiciary was not always willing to accept. Secondly, they challenged the principles of the free market by claiming that public health was a good that needed to be provided for all and not simply left to the profit motive. Crafting public-private solutions was, of course, one way to solve that issue. Thirdly, they had to deal with the ingrained American belief in self-sufficiency and suspicion of governmental interference. And all three of these themes are still very relevant today, of course. And lastly, all three Roosevelts only partly achieved their goals. Theodore was unable to secure national insurance and failed in his re-election bid, leaving the Progressive Party's extensive social welfare manifesto largely unrealized. Franklin also had to drop national insurance from the Social Security Act due to pressure from the American Medical Association, who regarded it as socialist and un-American. And of course, the Southern Democrats then ensured that the act would not apply to domestic or agricultural labor, typical occupations for Black Americans. So issues of race and gender have always been present when determining who the public is in public health, leading to many blind spots, deliberate exclusions, and failures. It is also crucial to identify who has held the power to determine who the public should be. Over the next couple of days, we will hear a lot about how public health has been framed in repressive and debilitating ways due to class, race, and/or gender bias, both within the US and through US foreign relations outside the United States as well. The American century is a useful frame for exploring this subject, it being bookended by two epidemics that entered the US from outside, exposing the country to the vulnerabilities of an inescapably interconnected world. In the intervening century, between the Spanish flu and COVID-19, the United States, through both private and public actors, set out to eradicate diseases around the world as part of the wider cause of global leadership, liberal internationalism, scientific modernism, and, to draw on Henry Luce here, of course, Good Samaritanism. A global great society, as Bob Reinhardt will tell us later today. This involves spectacular successes and failures, exposing the limits to scientific knowledge, political will, and US leadership in the provision of global public goods. And I find it important just to mention at this point that we are the Roosevelt Institute, but we're not into Roosevelt hagiography. So everything is on the table with this conference, and we're not looking to simply present a positive image of the many aspects of public health we're going to look at. So to round off this introduction, it's just worth reflecting also on how the personal health experiences of the Roosevelts provide a backdrop to our discussion. FDR's polio is, of course, well known. Less than well known, perhaps, is TR's asthma that had a profound influence on his own thinking regarding healthcare. And lastly, Eleanor's decision to refuse medication for her tuberculosis in November 1962, effectively ending her life, adds another dimension, equally relevant in a time of vaccination mandates. Where does the boundary lie between personal autonomy and responsibility on the one hand, and public health on the other? So on that note, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote for this afternoon and really for opening up the conference as a whole. And I'm very grateful to Naomi Rogers, Professor of the History of Medicine at Yale University, for taking on this role. Naomi's historical interests are quite broad. They cover gender and health, disease and public health, disability, medicine and film, and alternative medicine. And she has a whole stack of impressive publications, including Dirt and Disease, Polio Before FDR, 1992, An Alternative Path, The Making and Remaking of Hahnemann Medical College and Hospital of Philadelphia, 1998, Polio Wars, Sister Kenny and the Golden Age of American Medicine, from 2014. And her current book project examines the critics of medical orthodoxy since 1945, and that's entitled Health Activism and the Humanization of American Medicine, under contract with Oxford. Naomi is going to deliver a keynote for us now entitled Polio, Politics and the History of Disease. There will be time for Q&A at the end of Naomi's lecture. And do please be aware, since most of you are guests on the team system, that the chat option is unfortunately unavailable to most of you. So for any questions, do please raise your hand or do simply speak up if I fail to mention, fail to note your hand and you would like to ask a question. So do please make sure that, that you get noticed later on. Without further ado, Naomi, thank you again so much, and I give the word to you.
Giles, thank you so much. Can everybody hear me? Oh, terrific.
Sounded good.
And I want to make sure that the screen that I've just shared is visible to all. Good. I want to firstly thank the Roosevelt Institute so much for inviting me, not only to give this opening lecture, but also to be part of the conference. The papers have been very intriguing and thought-provoking, and I'm looking forward to discussions of them through the next couple of days. So let me get started right now. Living through the COVID pandemic has brought to the fore questions of the meanings and scope of public health in ways that I haven't seen since the AIDS crisis of the 1980s. And unlike COVID, AIDS was considered, for at least a decade anyway, as a pandemic that did not affect everyone. Here, I want to reflect not so much on what COVID has and has not taught us, but rather on what parts of the history of disease we might need to revisit, especially in thinking about public views of the proper use of state power. Right now, I wonder whether all historians of medicine, perhaps all scholars, have become historians of disease. And here I'm defining that field as encompassing medical care, health disparities, health cultures, and health politics. The lessons reporters have sought from the past have shifted, of course, as the public experience of COVID altered. I want to use some of those shifts today as a way to explore our understanding of disease as a threat and as a cultural resource. And let me just highlight here some of the analogies both reporters and historians have made. I'm just going to show you a couple of slides to make those kind of analogies. And the analogy that reporters and many historians have drawn on really throughout COVID, of course, is the previous major respiratory pandemic, the 1918-19 influenza pandemic. So there have been a lot of discussions about whether the early America took many of these kinds of decisions to stay at home. We know a little bit about that. It's called home quarantine in the early 20th century. We also know that both now and then there were open discussions of the deadly nature of these pandemics. And here I'm calling them the tactics of fear because they were also used by political leaders, by public health officials to kind of remind people of the nature of these diseases. In both cases, they led to alternative ways of conducting civic business. We obviously have fewer photographs from 1918, 1919, but here's an example of an open air court compared to an indoor fifth grade class. Alternative ways of going to church, and a constant awareness that it was important to dramatize the danger of a disease, especially for Americans and others who may have felt that it wouldn't come to them, or that if it did come, it wouldn't be that bad. And this has been a constant issue. I'm not suggesting this has been resolved. Here's just some examples of how to dramatize it. And of course, throughout, as a number of people have discussed in their work for this conference, it was and is the consistent politicizing of government health measures. Here you see both the Trump and the Biden administration taking on COVID as something in order to make powerful political points, both here examples of control with the advice of experts, and the other with the federal effort to express empathy and sympathy with the deaths from COVID. And the very interesting moment where former Vice President Dick Cheney issued a picture of himself wearing a mask with the hashtag Real Men Wear Masks, suggesting that indeed the masculinist argument that masks were for sissies or were inappropriate for real Americans, and attempting to counter that. Now, I'm not going to talk so much about fights around masking, although here I just want to remind you that many of these continue into the present day, protests around mask mandates and who should wear them and when. But just to also remind us all that fights around masking occurred during the influenza pandemic as well. So let me now just spend a little bit of time introducing my talk, and then I will begin my major presentation. In 20th century America, public health as a field and a profession has constantly struggled for prestige and power. Epidemics have often, but not always, provided opportunities to expand that power, gain greater public respect, and become more tightly integrated within political systems. In the case of polio and tuberculosis, though, public health departments did not realize such achievements. They became partners, but secondary partners, to organizations like the March of Dimes and National Tuberculosis Society, later the American Lung Association, which were far more influential in shaping political and cultural responses to disease. Both groups developed sophisticated ways to channel public fear and interest into political pressure. They helped to make elements of their particular disease visible and culturally significant, its etiology, epidemiology, and treatment, and tried to ameliorate gaps in the funding and availability of medical facilities, professionally trained providers, and research through a range of tactics. For the March of Dimes, my focus today, these tactics included crisis care programs in which physicians, nurses, iron lungs, and crutches were shipped in to communities in need, and then ongoing efforts to pay for professional training, equipment, as well as shaming any community without proper resources. The March of Dimes operated in a racist world. Medical training and care was segregated, and access to care was built on the assumption about the inferiority of Black bodies. Trying to remain neutral among the politicized civil rights of the New Deal and then later the 1950s got the March of Dimes in hot water. I'll talk a little bit about that later, as the organization sought to design race-affirming campaigns that presented Black children as visible and vulnerable polio victims, and at the same time to promote the organization as both race-aware and race-neutral. I will further address the relationship between the prestige of science and the power of public health in struggles to prevent health threats. By the 1940s and 50s, medical science was seen as crucial in helping technically skilled health officials identify the infected and the potentially contagious, and to prevent disease, especially with the rise of vaccination as a widely touted preventive technology. Public agencies such as health departments, however, struggled to convince ordinary Americans that their pronouncements were the sole authority in determining how to respond to the threat of disease. Americans listened to a range of figures offering contradictory guidance, at times in conflict with health officials and political leaders. The claim, constant through the 20th century and into the 21st century, that officials, of course, had the best interests of all Americans at heart, was a claim that frequently seemed to ring hollow. Access to medical care, as everyone knew, was restricted by race, class, and region. Perhaps the disease directives officials offered was similarly flawed. Americans expressed frustration and skepticism in response to official directives about disease, including polio, and families and parents continued to seek out ways to protect their children, no matter whether such precautions were considered effective or sensible or science-based. COVID has also provided a moment for thinking hard about the claims by health officials and political leaders that they're following the science. Officials in the past, as well as the present, have often been quick to explain popular dissent as a result of scientific ignorance and misinformation. Health teaching in schools and universities, based on the discoveries of laboratory science, especially bacteriology, blossomed in the mid-20th century, as did a wider cultural fascination with medical heroes. But popular eagerness in embracing scientific solutions and looking to scientists as experts was frequently leavened by frustration when answers were not clear or were seen as not immediately efficacious. Reporters watching recent problems of vaccine acceptance have assumed issues of access and compliance are distinctively novel. They've sought the history of the development and rollout of the polio vaccine, for example, assuming a smoother golden age. But as I shall argue here, even in the 1950s, a time when becoming a doctor was the loftiest dream for students and their parents, Americans expressed dissenting views about the efficacy of vaccines, medical research, and the tactics of health departments. So let me begin in 1947, when New Yorkers were horrified when they learned that there were a few cases of smallpox, a disease that by the early 1940s had already begun to be seen as one of those old-fashioned previous problems. The Commissioner of Health of New York City immediately urged New Yorkers to get vaccinated. And as you can see here from actually one of these iconic pictures, New Yorkers rushed to health department offices around the city in all the boroughs in order to get vaccinated. And indeed, there was no epidemic of smallpox in 1947. So this is, I think, an important jumping off point to look at the eagerness in which ordinary Americans sought out vaccination from their health department for a disease that they recognized as scary and deadly. Now, I want to make the point, first of all, about how widespread American faith was in science and in medical heroes. And here I just want to show examples of what were known as either science or real life comics, which were read by, I think, not only teenagers, but also many adult Americans as well. And often picked examples from the past to dramatize them. Here I want to point out that of the various famous people who were dramatized in these were public health heroes. Here, Walter Reed, the man who conquered yellow fever. And here, even more surprisingly, Stephen Smith, the 19th century physician who was concerned with housing reform and poverty, not topics that you would automatically think would make you a health hero, but nonetheless appearing in real life comics in 1946 with a mightier vision of a healthful city. Not surprisingly, throughout the 1940s and 50s, there were many comics that highlighted germ fighters. Here, Robert Koch in the 1880s confronts a group of physicians who tell him that killing germs with a chemical in the bloodstream is a wild dream. And just a reminder that, of course, comics around germ and germ fighters have continued into the 21st century. A comic in 1952. Now, one of the problems for highlighting polio as example of medical heroes in the 40s and early 50s is that despite the much money and propaganda and activities of the March of Dimes, polio still was not, it was unable to be prevented, and the treatment that you got if you were paralyzed could take many long months and years. So it's interesting, in order to come up with a heroic moment for polio, the comic writers have reached into the 1930s and made the argument that one of the heroes is the designer of the iron lung. And here you see a physician assuring a nurse that a patient is not in a coma, it's just a deep sleep of exhaustion. He rests while the respirator breathes for him, right? So this is the example of the heroic moment in 1952. So let me say just a word or so about polio, which will be my case study today. Polio was a novel epidemic. It had never occurred in epidemic form until the 1890s. It occurred first in some Scandinavian countries, and then in the northeast of the United States. And then it really began to take over both the United States and much of the rest of the world. It was, in other words, a 20th century epidemic, in some cases a pandemic. And you can see here the increasing number of epidemics. This was a very striking example for infectious diseases in the United States. The graphs were going the other way, right? And so, and it's only, as this second graph suggests, with the use of the Salk and the Saban vaccine that these epidemics began to decline. Now, the reason for this is that polio is a disease of cleanliness. The polio virus is endemic. It travels around communities, rural and urban communities, every 2 or 3 years. And mostly it affects very young children who get some gastrointestinal problems and then are fine and immune. But by the late 1890s and early 20th century, sanitation, nutrition, and childcare was improving in parts of the United States and Scandinavia, so that children were protected from this virus for a period of time until they were maybe 7 or 9. And then when they were exposed to the virus, they were more likely to get paralysis. And that's what we call epidemic polio, cases of paralysis. Understanding this epidemiology took many, many decades. And it was a very difficult disease to not only treat, but to understand. But let me just say it was a very scary disease, although it never was a significant cause of morbidity or mortality in the United States. I want to spend just a minute reminding you of the ways that Americans responded to one of the major epidemics in 1916. Immigrant families stayed in the city, in New York, in New York City, in Newark, in Philadelphia, while wealthy families got on trains or took carriages, as you can see, and fled the country, into the country. There were quarantines imposed by local and state public health departments, helped by the Public Health Service. But the Public Health Service was also very aware of economic issues. And here you can see an example of a certificate that was given to children to state that they had shown a health certificate from their health authorities, sometimes their physician or a public health department, to say that they had been free from polio. And these were certificates that children, for example, could present in order to try to travel from one town to another with their parents, or as happened in New Jersey, children who needed to travel from New Jersey to Philadelphia for work had to present these certificates in order to be able to be admitted to Philadelphia. So just a word about Franklin Roosevelt. It's a sign of his incredible wealth and effective isolation as a boy and a young man, that he was not exposed to the polio virus until 1921, when he was in his late 30s. He was paralyzed, his legs were paralyzed, they remained paralyzed for the rest of his life. But all through the 1920s, he was seeking ways to return not so much to his legal profession, but to public life. He was an aspiring politician, and he visited and then bought Warm Springs, Georgia, a mineral springs health resort, then actually on its last legs in the early 20s, and he turned it into a polio rehab center. And he continued to visit Warm Springs while he was governor of New York and while he was president as well. At Warm Springs, Roosevelt allowed others to see his leg braces. But outside that community, he pretended that he was not disabled. He did not believe that he could ever be elected governor or even president as a disabled man. In the 1930s, once he was elected president, he became patron of polio fundraising, a symbol of someone who had conquered the disease, which is how he described himself. And birthday ball campaigns organized in January around his birthday raised almost $1 million each year for polio fundraising, especially for the funding of Warm Springs. Polio historians have called his effort to conceal his disability his splendid deception. You can see here the use of a long cigarette holder. He also used to use a cape as ways to draw the eye to his upper body and shoulders and head. When he visited the many buildings during the 1930s and 40s that had steps, these Secret Service would build temporary ramps so that his car could drive up to the entrance, and he was then usually carried from the car into the main part of the building. Any reporters who tried to take pictures of that had their cameras knocked from their hands and destroyed. And then once he left the building, the ramps were taken down. By 1936 or so, Roosevelt, although the New Deal was in full force, was facing some political troubles, including arguments that Warm Springs had been too politicized, too close to the Democratic Party. And so he and his advisors decided to separate polio fundraising explicitly from the Democratic Party and set up a separate charity known as the March of Dimes, or the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, which became America's largest disease philanthropy. And it engaged in two kinds of service providing. Outbreaks. When there were outbreaks, it would provide medical care equipment and sometimes build temporary hospitals. And then it provided ongoing programs with training and care in rehabilitation and also scientific research. This went hand in glove with Roosevelt's New Deal administration, especially as a part of the Social Security Act, as Giles has already mentioned, which provided services for, quote, crippled children with federal grants to states. And these worked together, were allied with the March of Dimes. Now, I want to spend a minute talking about the head of the March of Dimes, Basil O'Connor. He was Irish Catholic at a time when being Irish Catholic usually meant that you had no chance to make it in mainstream elite society, born in a working class family, but a donor enabled him to attend Dartmouth College, and then a scholarship and the same donor enabled him to be admitted and attend Harvard Law School, and he became a lawyer, practicing first in Boston and then in New York. He worked with oil companies and real estate companies and became relatively wealthy and very ambitious. And he saw that he needed a partnership with a big name. And he met Franklin Roosevelt in his own building, and they became partners. Roosevelt was simply looking for a place to begin reintegrating himself in the Democratic Party after his polio disability and his slow learning how to walk with his braces. And O'Connor was looking for the Roosevelt name. They became friends and partners. O'Connor was a trustee of the Warm Springs Foundation and then headed the Warm Springs Foundation. And then in 1937, at Roosevelt's request, became president of the March of Dimes, which he remained until his death in 1972. Also during the war, he was asked to be chair of the American Red Cross. So there were many health-related philanthropies that he was engaged in, and he became a very influential person in guiding the March of Dimes and also retaining its connection to Roosevelt and to the Democratic Party. The March of Dimes itself promoted both health, hope, and fear, perhaps a little more fear than hope. Here, example of a March of Dimes movie with the threatening black shadow of the crippler over happy children playing in a lake. And the March of Dimes also presented polio as a white disease. Warm Springs, functioning in the heart of Georgia, all patients, physical therapists, physicians, nurses, and pool attendants were all white. And it remained a segregated institution. Here's just an example. You don't see this very often. I found this photo in a March of Dimes archives. And here's the movie theater at Warm Springs, probably around 1950 or so. And you can see the white patients, white staff, and so on. And then separated by an interior white picket fence. You don't see an interior white picket fence very often. You can see a few of the African-American staff of Warm Springs. Laundry, cleaning, and janitorial work was done by African Americans throughout the functioning of Warm Springs. Now, it's not that there weren't civil rights protests about this, especially as Roosevelt himself was explicitly trying to get support from the Black community. And there was a great awareness that this was a really terrible optics to have Roosevelt's own Warm Springs be a white segregated facility. However, the trustees of Warm Springs and the power also of white Southern Democrats meant that it was impossible to get anybody to agree to desegregate Warm Springs itself. So instead, the March of Dimes paid for the construction of a Black polio hospital at the Tuskegee Institute, which opened in 1941, which hired Black nurses and doctors and then trained Black nurses and doctors and physical therapists around the country to come to that hospital and learn the latest polio techniques. It was, of course, a very small institution, and in no way am I suggesting that it transformed the care of polio for most Black Americans. The March of Dimes also hired its first interracial, although I think the right word really should be Negro, March of Dimes official, Charles Bynum, in 1944, whose task was to reach out to middle-class Black communities and raise money for the March of Dimes. But here, and you can see that the first Black poster child emerged in 1947. But in fact, most medical care for Black Americans, which was much more typical of the kind experienced by Olympic athlete Wilma Rudolph, who had polio as a young girl and wore a leg brace and was treated at a clinic at Meharry Medical College in Nashville, Tennessee, which was 50 miles from her home. She and her mother took a long, long bus ride twice or three times a week in order to go to this clinic. She wore a leg brace for about 7 years, and as she recalled it, my doctor told me I would never walk again. My mother told me I would. I believed my mother. And here's a picture of her winning one of her 3 gold medals as track and field in the Summer Olympics at Rome. Even the March of Dimes propaganda material reflected the continuing racial segregation in medicine. And so here you can see posters of a Black and a white child in which there is a Black physician caring for a Black child and a white physician caring for a white child. Strangely, the nurse appears to be white, or perhaps it didn't matter quite as much what her race was supposed to be in the second of those 2 insert pictures. I wanted to mention an example of the power of Basil O'Connor's political vision by asking the question, why was there no National Polio Institute? So after the Second World War, there was a massive expansion of the National Institutes of Health. They became institutes rather than just one on cancer. You see the founding of a heart institute, mental health, arthritis, neurological disease and blindness, allergy, and so on. And in the late 1940s, there were many hearings in Congress to talk about what kinds of diseases and conditions the National Institute of Health should expand to. And the reason that there's no National Polio Institute is that Basil O'Connor said no. Basil O'Connor argued that charity-directed medical research was the American way, by which he meant individuals who joined together for the common good without any thought of annulment in terms of money or privilege. And March of Dimes officials who came and spoke to Congress during the 1940s consistently argued that if the March of Dimes research program were taken over by the government, that their greatest appeal for public support would be removed. And then Basil O'Connor's brother, John J. O'Connor, who'd been a House of Representatives member until 1939, and then he became a March of Dimes official, came to Congress to tell the story of his son, a recent graduate from Harvard Medical School who'd been paralyzed by polio, saying, "I did not want then, and I do not want now, any government representative, whether he's a scientist or a doctor, treating me or my people under such circumstances. I want to get the best private treatment. And this proposed research by the government is bound to develop to the government taking over completely. Even a government research bureau, which just collected data, is the proverbial camel getting its nose under the tent. And from that time on, you have the whole animal and the whole carcass, which I guess suggests it's a dead animal, right in the center of the ring. You've got the government taking care of the personal disease of our people, a completely totalitarian idea that was never intended in America. And with such arguments, O'Connor simply made sure that even proposals for a polio institute or a polio commission were defeated. By the early 1950s, the continuing medical research program funded by the March of Dimes, and the March of Dimes had way much more money to fund polio research and virology than the National Institutes of Health had really until the 1960s or so, led to significant success. Virologist Jonas Salk developed the Salk polio vaccine based on a killed virus or an inactivated poliovirus. And with the encouragement of Basil O'Connor, the March of Dimes set up the world's largest clinical trial to test the vaccine on American school children around the country. This was a massive event in 1954, leading to Salk, of course, making the cover of Time magazine. And I just want to give you some examples of how this clinical trial actually worked. Once again, the March of Dimes, as it had done before, worked with the segregated school system, right? So this is before, well, this is actually the same year as, but before Brown versus Board of Education made any difference at all to segregated schools. And so the March of Dimes went to Black schools as well as white schools, and occasionally, as you can see here from Memphis, bussed in Black children into a white school so that all of them could could participate in the clinical trial. The Salk vaccine was approved in 1955, although just at that moment, in April 1955, there were reports of some vaccinated children getting polio, and by the end of June, indeed, 5 deaths had been reported. the Qatar vaccine was withdrawn by the end of April, and there was a fear that perhaps it wasn't just the Qatar laboratories, that maybe the whole vaccine program was wrong and dangerous. But a group of virologists met after all the vaccine programs were postponed, and in the following week, they agreed to resume them, arguing that it's just that the Qatar laboratories had not followed proper guidance. But as you can imagine, this certainly left many American families very skeptical of the Salk vaccine. The March of Dimes has partnered with health departments to promote the vaccine. Here you see the use of one of the great celebrities of the 1950s, Elvis Presley, getting his shot from the commissioner of the New York City Health Department, hanging out with one of the March of Dimes poster children. And the departments of health took on the rollout and promotion and giving of vaccines around the country. Here, a Spanish language pamphlet issued by the New York City Health Department, and a mobile van staffed mainly by black and white nurses heading into Harlem in order to give Salk vaccine shots. By 1959, another virologist funded by the March of Dimes, Albert Saban, was testing his own distinctive polio vaccine, his live attenuated polio vaccine, or oral polio vaccine. He tested it in the USSR, and it was licensed by the Public Health Service in 1961. Indeed, this was seen as working much better and was much easier because it was an oral vaccine than the shots were. And you get extensive immunization campaigns in the 1960s to get people to take the new oral vaccine. Its appeal was that it could be just a little bit of liquid could be dropped on a sugar cube. And it also meant that it could be given by, it didn't have to be given by a doctor or a nurse. It could be given by non-specially trained personnel, which made it the absolute best technology to spread into the developing world as well. And in 1991, the last known case of polio in the Western Hemisphere was this Peruvian boy, and polio is currently very close to being eradicated. I think we're only about three to four countries down. The March of Dimes, of course, in a way, created the end of the March of Dimes, but it continued as an organization. And after some debate over what it would focus on, it finally decided on birth defects, and Basil O'Connor died in 1972. So I want to turn now to talk a little bit about anti-vaccination. So here are just examples from recently from COVID protests around the United States. And let's look at the state of vaccination and anti-vaccination in the 1950s. So clearly there were many people with the incredible excitement of the Salk vaccine that hoped that this would be the beginning of the vaccine victory over other diseases, here exemplified in one Miami Daily News op-ed cartoon of cancer, heart disease, and other diseases, thinking about when will our vaccines come. The American Public Health Association and public health officials generally had warned about the dangers of anti-vaccination and anti-vaccinationists since at least the 1920s, probably even before that. And here you can see examples of efforts to explain what was going on in order to convince ordinary Americans that this was such a terrible idea, that in fact anti-vaccinationists, here this is about resistance to smallpox vaccination were driven by lies, ignorance, bigotry, and carelessness. And a reminder in 1930 that in order for public health to do its job, right, to make a healthier world, public cooperation is necessary. However, we know from at least the 1950s that Americans fought polio every way they could. And that included a long-standing belief that polio could be spread by insects. Let me just say here, no, it cannot be spread by insects. And this was something that health officials and scientists had been arguing since at least the 1930s. But Americans actually paid no attention whatsoever. And in the 1950s and 60s, they not only bought domestic fly sprays, but also paid for their local county and city and state agencies to spray DDT and other pesticides in order, just in case, to make sure that they were polio safe. Let me say a little bit about anti-vaccination movements. In the United States, they began in the late 19th century, influenced by European, especially British anti-vaccination movements, and which argued that vaccination was both dangerous and also an attack on individual liberties. By the 1950s, the anti-vaccination movement around polio had continued the suspicion of biological products, a notion that compulsory vaccination laws, even if they were supported by the Supreme Court, were wrong and anti-American, and also argued that who was to say that the polio virus actually caused paralysis? A number of anti-vaccinationists argued that actually it was parents who didn't know how to look after their children properly, and that was the cause of polio paralysis. And here, just blown up, one of the pamphlets. Let me just say that many of these pamphlets were sent to polio experts and health departments around the country, as well as, I'm sure, to ordinary Americans as well. Here, calling for senators and congressmen to demand an open hearing to hear the truth about polio and to invite doctors of every healing profession, right, suggesting that the March of Dimes perhaps was too beholden to the AMA and to orthodox medicine, and that poliophobia, definitely attack on the March of Dimes, should be exposed and replaced with the truth. And if people learned the truth, that you would never license a polio vaccine. Duane Miller, who was one of the instigators of many of these anti-polio vaccine pamphlets, offered a challenge to the March of Dimes, to Jonas Salk, and to the Public Health Service, saying that polio patients in any designated hospital they wanted should be treated by chiropractic methods of polio care. And it should be done in front of reporters from Life magazine, Associated Press, and also even TV, to show how much better they were than the kind of methods the March of Dimes was funding. And also that Miller himself would serve as a human guinea pig and allow blood from a new polio patient to be injected into his bloodstream, or he would take it orally. Either way, asking, was Basil O'Connor man enough to accept these challenges for the good of little children everywhere? Now, safeguarding the public's health in the Cold War, the anti-polio vaccine movement was part of a broader movement that linked together a number of public health and medical proposals, and argued that they were anti-American, perhaps pro-Soviet, as well as incredibly dangerous. And so here I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about the unholy three, which linked together fluoridated water, polio vaccines, and mental hygiene, which was the expansion of mental health services, arguing here that the vaccine drive was the entering wedge for nationwide socialized medicine by the Public Health Service, heavily infiltrated by Russian-born doctors, and in enemy hands could destroy a whole generation. So I'm not going to talk about mental hygiene, but I want to spend a little time talking about fluoridation. Fluoridation as a public health practice began in 1945 with the acceptance by the City Council of Grand Rapids, who agreed to be the site of what was called an experiment, where the waterworks in Grand Rapids had sodium fluoride poured into them that entered the water supply, so that the citizens of Grand Rapids began to drink artificially fluoridated water. This was monitored by the Public Health Service. School children had their saliva tested and their teeth examined regularly as part of this project. And it was intended to take 10 years. But within 6 years, scientists observed significant decrease in tooth decay. And the results were so successful that the control city, so this was another city where this was happening without fluoridated water, demanded that it get fluoridated water as well, and brought an end to this controlled study. And communities across the country began fluoridating their water with the help of the Public Health Service and the Surgeon General, and after a couple of years with the support of the American Dental Association. But very early on, anti-fluoridation activists emerged, rejecting fluoridation whenever it was offered by a vote in communities around the country as well. Printed handbills featured a skull and crossbones with "Get the poison out of our drinking water. Do you want to drink this?" And the Dan Smoot report, a very conservative, part of a conservative propaganda movement of many newsletters throughout the country, cited Huxley's Brave New World, in which government mandated drugs placate the population. How could ruling authorities ever manage to give drugs to an entire population? Smoot, and his answer was, well, via the water, just like fluoridation. And from 54 to 55, 60% of communities who had the opportunity to vote defeated fluoridation proposals. And here you see an example from the Dallas Morning News in the early 1960s, offering to get rid of fluoride that may have been added to drinking water in order to be able to drink purified miracle water. And I want to end here with a discussion of a woman who came to Congress to talk about fluoridation in 1954. Miss Florence Birmingham was a white elite woman, head of the Massachusetts Women's Political Club, and she came in order to explain why fluoridation was so dangerous. And I will say that by the end of the hearings, Congress decided that this was a mess and that they were not going to try to enforce any kind of federal mandate one way or the other. She argued that it was a mass experimentation on human beings, and it could lead to the wholesale adoption of euthanasia and death by needle for the weak and unwanted. That we needed men and women like the colonial days to stand up for what was right, even if it meant opposing autocratic power. She blamed Oscar Ewing, head of the Federal Security Agency, of using the pressure of the federal government, and here she also means the Democratic federal government during the 1940s, to convince city leaders in Grand Rapids and other towns to experiment with fluoridation beginning in 1945, pointing out that the Nuremberg trials for Nazi criminals for experimenting on humans started in 1946. And those trials outraged the conscience of the civilized world, yet a department of our government was deliberately committing the same illegal criminal act en masse. That fluoridation was illegal, promotion of a deadly poison by a government agency. It took the public's money without giving any scientific proof of therapeutic value, and that all claims of benefits to children's teeth were based on unproven, misconstrued, misinterpreted, and superficial facts. And here's just an example from her hearings, in which she also notes that in 1952, many anti-fluoridation activists were really hopeful that with a change in the presidency, right, with the election of Eisenhower, that there would be an end to this experiment, but we should have known better. So that regardless of how good the intentions of the new secretary of the brand new Department of Health, Education, and Welfare might have been, her undersecretary was Nelson Rockefeller. And she said, well, that doomed any hope for change, because the Rockefellers own or control the aluminum trusts, chemical fertilizers, and drug syndicates. And they also have so much money that they control news releases and newspapers by controlling millions of dollars in advertising. So I've gone from COVID to polio to fluoride and back. And here are just some of the issues I'd like to kind of pull out that I have talked about today. And one is state responsibility and authority. In times of crisis, like a global pandemic or maybe a security threat from the USSR, what special powers are seen as legitimate to use and to be accepted by the public? And how should those powers be assessed? Is it a threat to individual liberty? Is it critical for global and national security? Are they undemocratic? Are they un-American? And what about the vision of citizenship? Individualism, as many people in this conference have pointed out, is central to American identity. Citizens are expected to be cautious yet strong and self-reliant, caring yet within set limits. Now, are those limits your own self or your own family or your own immediate community? What about defending public health measures? The tactics of dramatizing the consequences of disease or a health threat, like a patient on a ventilator or a patient with crutches, and the dangers of contagion, which may be dangerous germs, poisons in the water, dangerous ideas spreading covertly and undermining the healthy body politic, and what happens when disease threats fade. The demand for experts without politics, an issue that, as I've suggested, continues to this day as well. In the 1940s and 50s, you see a very high prestige of science, an awareness and a celebration of scientists and physicians as heroes and discoverers, but also seen as perhaps misguided and inconsistent, and as government agencies, including health departments, allied with powerful forces such as aluminum and chemical companies. So, and finally, of course, we see shifting notions of health. What is health? It's protection from deadly infection, but to what extent? How much should worrying about this protection limit social and economic life? In COVID, for example, children's mental health has been an issue for those children not in school. A loss of job in the United States, at least, can mean the loss of health insurance. There's also, of course, a faith in the individual control of health, although, as a number of people in this conference have already noted, this totally undermines a notion of social determinants in shaping health, such as medical racism. And this leads to the idea of doing your own research, which I put in quotes, to assess the safety of vaccines or other health measures. So I was thinking of ending this talk by comparing the WHO smallpox statue opened in 2010, which commemorates global and national collaboration in the eradication of smallpox, and comparing it to the continuing fear of infection and death here with a Navajo man standing outside his home in Winter Rock, Arizona, saying absolutely no visitors. COVID killed more than 500 people in the Navajo Nation by September, and the Navajo Nation has been profoundly affected, as have many reservations across the country, by COVID. But instead, I'm actually ending with a picture from an article in the New York Times this week, which shows Dr. Allison Berry, a health officer for a county in Washington State, being escorted to her car by a local sheriff after she attended a COVID briefing in September 2021. And the reason she's being escorted by a sheriff is that she had proposed mask mandates and talked about the idea of requiring proof of vaccination in her home county, and received death threats to her family as well as herself. And the title of the article, Threats, Resignation, and 100 New Laws, is subtitled, Why Public Health is in Crisis. So I think I'd like to leave it there. Thank you all very much.
Naomi, thank you so much for that wonderfully wide-ranging keynote. And you really do bring home to us how a lot of these debates, often to do with clashes between personal freedom and state power, have been around for many years, often expressed in exactly the same ways, with the same visual methods and the same kind of language. I would like to give